seat if you're here in person. If you are joining us at home, you're online, you're somewhere, we are super grateful that you are here as well. Coming together to study what obviously is just one of those classic feel-good passages in the Bible, right? I mean, just filled with nothing but good news and uplifting thoughts and just what you were hoping to hear on a Sunday to carry you through life in a difficult world. Because you're like, yeah, funny you mentioned that. I noticed that it seemed to be a little thin on those kind of themes, right? It seems like the Cliff Notes version of what Jesus is saying here is, hey, if you want to be my follower in the world, there are going to be times when you are persecuted. So think about that in terms of action. And if you want to be my follower in the world, there are going to be times when you are hated, right? Think about that in terms of an attitude, right? There's going to be moments where you and I encounter an energy and an attitude coming off people that is not just indifferent to our faith, it's hostile to our faith. And there's going to be times where that attitude is going to spill out into actual action, where people are going to attempt to harm us because of our allegiance to the Son of God. And the tendency is to hear passages like that and say, yeah, I get it. Like, we've seen that over the 2,000-year history of the church. We can point to historic examples, and the tendency sometimes is to think about different corners of the world where you're supporting a missionary or you've heard somebody come and talk about the fact that it's illegal to follow Jesus, but we tend to just fast forward through passages like that in 21st century Washington. You're kind of like, okay, good, it's there. I know where to find it if I need it, but maybe it doesn't really connect with our situation. On the other hand, I think sometimes we fast forward through passages like this, not because they don't feel like they connect with our situation, but that they just make us uncomfortable. Right? I mean, even when I stood up here and said, hey, if you are closely aligned with the Son of God, there's going to be times that people may hate you for that. There's going to be times that people are going to persecute you for that. There's something in all of us that just kind of cringes. And we're like, no, I don't think so. Like, I think if we are following Jesus well, it's always just going to be a festival of love and grace and mercy, and everybody's going to be so happy for our redemptive presence in the room, and we just kind of want to hold out for that hope, but we know that that's not always the reality. So what I want us to do today is to wrestle with some shocking statements, right? John 15:18 is not meant to go down easy. If the world hates you, understand that it hated me before it hated you. It almost feels like thin consolation where Jesus is like, hey, they hate you. Remember, they hated me too. And you're like, well, okay, I'm sorry for you, and I'm sorry for me, and I'm just sorry that it has to be that way. But I want to talk about what it looks like to live our lives in 21st century America with this kind of an understanding. It's important when we do that to keep texts like this in the overall context of Scripture, because that's going to prevent us from making a couple of different mistakes. If you were here last week, you know that we're working our way through John chapter 14, 15, 16, looking at the conversation that Jesus has with his closest disciples on the Thursday night that he will celebrate that last Passover, that he will go to the garden, that he ultimately will be betrayed and arrested and go to the cross the following day. And if you were here last week, you know that this section on persecution and hatred comes immediately after a section in which Jesus has been talking about his love for the disciples, these 11 men. Judas is out of the picture at this point. He's gone off to betray him. His love for these 11 men. His love for you, his love for me, this beautiful call that we would love one another as Christ has loved us. That's the immediate context. That's what we've been swimming in here of like, hey, here's the love of God for you, and here's the love that we're supposed to to have for each other And then it almost feels like this tangent on persecution. But it's not a tangent because Jesus is trying to save us from two different errors, right? There is a tendency in all of us to assume that in moments of difficulty, we have somehow strayed from the will of God, that something is wrong. There's something about persecution, hatred, difficulty, suffering that inevitably causes us to question the goodness of God. There's something about difficulty in this world that causes us to question the love of God. I don't care how many different theology degrees you have. I don't care how many years you have been in the church. If you made it through the last 15 months and didn't have a moment where you questioned the goodness of God, I just don't think you're paying attention very much. I mean, if you made it through the last 15 months and there wasn't at least one night where you laid awake in bed being like, does God really love me? If there wasn't a night that you laid in bed being like, does God even exist? Like, look at the world. Look at what's happening out there. If we've never been tempted to question that, I just don't think we're paying enough attention to either the world or the reality of our own soul. Right? So Jesus, what he's doing is he's trying to slide in here and he's like, I just told you how much I love you. I just told you that my love for you is going to compel me to go to the wood of the cross and to die for you. That's how loved you are. Don't get thrown off that love when you have days where it feels like the whole world is against you simply because you're doing your best to follow Jesus. He's like, please don't doubt my love for you in that moment. But he's also, kind of flip side of that, he's trying to make it clear that his love for us will not deliver us from all forms of persecution and all forms of suffering. A point that would be made in graphic detail 24 hours later when the perfect love of the Father for a perfect Son did not deliver Jesus from the ultimate form of persecution. That he hung half naked on the wood of a cross outside of Jerusalem, the object of violent hatred, the object of the worst persecution the world had the capacity to throw at somebody. And in that moment, the love of God didn't lift Jesus up off of the cross. In that moment, the love of God held his Son on the wood of the cross so that you and I could be alive and free. It's not God's love for us doesn't mean he's always going to deliver us from persecution. And again, that's a hard thing to get straight. We have to hold that both in tension. Man, okay, so God loves me and he may allow me to endure persecution. And that persecution shouldn't cause me to doubt God's love for me. And I need to hold that together, right? This isn't just a random tweet about the potential of persecution and hatred in the world. This is deeply connected to the overall message of the gospel. This makes sense in the story that Jesus is inviting us to live our lives in. But you also have to notice that Jesus doesn't call his followers to go out and intentionally seek persecution. He doesn't say, go out and make it your ambition to see just how hated you can be. In fact, and we get this from the Apostle Paul, this isn't a direct quote from Jesus, but it encapsulates so much of Jesus' teaching. Romans chapter 12, verse 8, where Paul says this, he says, if possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Right? And we need to hold on to that, right? Because the goal of today is not, all right, Restoration City, whether you're here in person or online, let's just see how much trouble we can go get ourselves in this week. Next Sunday will be Testimony Sunday, and whoever has the best story of persecution and hatred, wins a free something. I don't know what the church would give away that would be compelling, but a free lunch with Chris, Kim, and Natalie, or whatever. You get something for free, because that works really well for Oprah. Why not in the church? Right? We're not going to do that, right? It's not this idea of like, all right, let's just go see what we can do. No, the goal is go live at peace. Go be an ambassador of grace. Go live as the gentle presence of the Son of God in your workplace. Go be the person who's willing to do the hard work of actually listening to other people rather than just incessantly inflicting your opinion on everybody around you. Go be this healing presence of God. But be aware that as you do that, as you strive to live in the wake of the one who is the Prince of Peace, there's going to be moments where it's not going to go great. Whether it's in the attitude that you are received with or it's in some of the actions. But I think part of what Jesus is saying is, hey, it would be brutally unfair of me not to prepare you for that. That's kind of what I feel a little bit this morning of like, well, it would be unfair for me as a pastor not to prepare you for that, right? Probably not my favorite thing to preach on. Probably like, hey, you know what? Here would be a great Sunday for the church. Let's talk about persecution and hatred. Woohoo, great. Particularly if today's your first time. So glad you're here. That doesn't necessarily come easily to me. But Jesus has the sense of like, look, I know the reality of what y'all are stepping into, and I got to get you ready for it. His disciples would have been shocked to hear that, right? Because they just keep holding their breath. They're like, okay, we get it. We've been following you for 3 years. When are you finally going to topple Rome, enthrone yourself on the throne of David and rule from Jerusalem? Like, when are you going to bring about this kingdom of heaven? And remember, Jesus in this whole conversation is like, yeah. You are going to embody the kingdom of heaven. You're going to bring heaven to earth right in this moment. But the ultimate establishment of that kingdom is going to come in the future. There's going to be a day where Jesus rules and reigns on the throne of David, but that day is not today, and he's trying to get his followers ready for life in a troubled world, and he's like, yeah, as much as you want me to just boot Rome out and create heaven on earth right now, it isn't going to happen. And they would have been shocked by that. In the same way that we find ourselves a little unsettled and a little like, really? Like, for real? Like, persecution and hatred? Okay. They would have felt that. Part of what Jesus is saying is asking his disciples, he's like, why is that such a surprise to you? Like, you've been following me for 3 years. And what they would have seen over the course of 3 years is that Jesus had some tremendous highs. Right? I mean, he had, hey, cool, there's 20,000 people here. Why don't you all have a seat? Dinner's on me. Right? I'll just take some loaves and fish and multiply it, and there'll be more left over at the end than we started with. Right? He had the moment of let's turn water into the best wine that the head waiter at the wedding has ever tasted in his life, right? Thereby earning Jesus a permanent invitation to all future weddings throughout Galilee, right? I mean, he's had these moments where the crowds were with him. He's had these moments where they wanted to make him king that day, where they hung on every word. But he's also had these brutal collisions with the religious leaders where they've denounced him and he's called them a brood of vipers. Right? He's had these moments where, he's so tight with Peter, and then he's had, hey, Peter, get behind me, Satan. He's had these moments where he's collided with Rome, and then what we know is over the next 24 hours, all of those collisions are going to amplify. Right, that he's going to have sort of this ultimate showdown with Pilate, where Pilate's going to ask him, are you the king of the Jews? And rather than taking the opportunity to diffuse a tragic misunderstanding and stand there and be like, look, man, I talk about a kingdom, but it's just like a spiritual kingdom. It's like a metaphor. I'm no threat to Rome. Pilate says, are you the king of the Jews? And Jesus looks right back in his eye and he's like, it is as you say. He wasn't going to topple Rome militarily. He was just going to give people a vision for humanity that would make the brutal imperialistic design of Rome unpalatable. Right? He was a threat to Rome. He was a threat to the religious establishment of his day, to their customs and their rules and their regulations. Right? He was a threat to all of this, so much so that he is going to get himself killed. He's going to get himself killed in a confederacy that involved Rome and the Sanhedrin, the Jewish ruling council, and the mob, right? Getting those three groups of people to agree on anything was borderline impossible. It just didn't happen, right? It would be like, oh my goodness, Tucker Carlson and Rachel Maddow agree on something. Like, no, that just doesn't ever happen, or ever, your pundits of choice. It's like, yeah, they're never on the same page, right? Rome and the Jewish establishment was never on the same page, except for when it came to Jesus. Not to embrace him, but to kill him. And all he's saying is, look, if you're going to live faithful to me, if you're going to follow in the pattern of my life, you should expect that there's going to be moments that people embrace you, and you should expect that there's moments where people are going to reject you. Right? So in a sense, the whole passage is just kind of truth in advertising. It's just sort of the like, hey, now you know a little of what to expect. Don't let it throw you. Don't let it dissuade you from believing in God's love for you when you encounter that. But I think if you press a little bit deeper into the text, you realize that Jesus is inviting us to live our lives anchored in 3 different commitments. Right? He's actually doing something a little more here than like, hey, FYI, it's going to get rocky every once in a while. Don't worry, I still love you. He's actually inviting us to build our life on 3 commitments. They are 3 commitments that will increase the likelihood of us experiencing persecution, that will increase the likelihood of us encountering some form of hatred. And I think one of the things that will happen as we walk through these commitments is that we will realize that sometimes the idea of persecution and hatred seems so foreign to us because these commitments seem so foreign to us. In other words, maybe if we were living a little bit more in line with what God was asking from us, things would get a little more rougher for us on a somewhat more frequent basis, right? So these commitments may very well lead you into persecution, may very well lead you into hatred, but they also are the commitments that we hold to in the face of persecution or hatred. So, right, really, this is sort of the action point of the sermon, right? The goal is not to go out and find yourself some persecution. The goal is to say, all right, I'm willing to build my life on 3 different commitments. Number 1, a life of noticeable distinction and identification. John chapter 15, verse 19. If you were of the world would love you as its own. However, because you are not of the world, but I have chosen you out of it, the world hates you. What Jesus is saying to these first century followers is, hello, your life is not supposed to look like everybody else's life. Right? If the only impact that Jesus is making on your life is how you choose to spend an hour and 10 minutes of your life on a Sunday morning, then we are falling far short of what Jesus is calling us to live into. He's saying you're not meant to conform to the pattern of this world. In fact, Paul says that explicitly, again, in Romans chapter 12. Do not be conformed by the pattern of this world, but instead be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Meaning you're not supposed to look like, act like, respond like, talk like everybody else at work. You should be noticeably distinct. You shouldn't blend in with the crowd at happy hour. You shouldn't always feel at home in the conversations that break out in your extended family who don't know God the way you do. You shouldn't always feel like you are being carried along by the culture of this city. You should have a sense that you are swimming upstream in the culture of this city. Eugene Peterson describes the church as a community of life in a culture of death. Dramatic language, but not wrong. Not unbiblical. And that's unsettling to us because there's something in our humanity that just wants to fit in. My work is hard enough, and now I got to go be just noticeably distinct for Jesus? It's already hard enough to make it through Thanksgiving, and now I need to be noticeably different? Oh, come on. And Jesus is like, man, but here's the thing. If people can't see a visible difference in our lives, why do we think that they're ever going to be all that interested in Jesus? Right? It makes no sense to a watching world when we come together on Sundays and preach things like we say here often as a church, the gospel changes everything. But then those who know us look at our lives and are like, it doesn't look like the gospel's changed very much at all. Right? And that's not to beat up on us. That's just to remind us that you're not getting it wrong in the moments where you feel like you don't fit in. Right? If you're part of a community of life and a culture of death, there's going to be moments that it's a little uncomfortable for you on the ultimate Frisbee team. It doesn't mean that you quit the ultimate Frisbee team. It doesn't mean that you go into isolation. It doesn't mean that you back away from the extended family. It doesn't mean you back away from the difficult neighbors. It does not mean that we pull back from the world. That's not what Jesus is saying. He is saying, I have just called you to live your life differently, and it should be noticeable. But by the way, it's not just, okay, I get it, there's something different about her, right? It's not just, oh, I get it, there's something different about him. There should be moments where it becomes clear that our noticeable distinction comes via our noticeable identification with Christ. Right? John 15, 20 to 21. Remember the word I spoke to you. A servant is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will also persecute you. If they kept my word, they will also keep yours. But they will do all these things to you on account of my name, because they don't know the one who sent me. Right? This is not just a call to be the nice person at the office, right? This is not just a call to like, hey, you're going to have to go ahead and figure out how to curse a little bit less. Like, Jesus is probably all for that and like, yeah, go ahead. Like, that's probably not helping your witness at work. But there's supposed to be moments where we're not just the moral person, we're not just the good guy, we're not just the good cousin, that we're the like, oh, I can see that her life is actually patterned off of the life of Jesus, right? Which would require us to press into all these new areas of Christian spirituality. Right? We tend to reduce following Jesus to, all right, we won't sleep together until we get married, and we're not going to get drunk, and I really will try my best not to curse anymore, and all of these kind of moral precepts, which are good. I'm not taking anything away from that, but Jesus is like, hey, yes, in the midst of all of that, here's something else to chew on. You're supposed to love your enemies. Right? That's not secular morality. That's distinct gospel spirituality. I'm supposed to love my enemies? I'm supposed to bless those who persecute me? Right? When pressed to go 1 mile, I'm supposed to go 2. When asked for my coat, I'm supposed to give him my sweater too. I'm supposed to turn the other cheek. I mean, there's this whole realm of stuff that God is inviting us into that we often are like, phew, no way, man. But if you really want to visibly identify with Christ, that's where we need to become increasingly comfortable living. Not just being the good kid, but trying to live and respond like Jesus would live and respond. Trying to be the person in your office who's open to interruption because you truly want to get to know your coworkers. Being the person who's sensitive to what God's Spirit is doing through you as you go about the daily rhythms of your life. And just saying, all right, God, I want to be the person that shows up today and is constantly asking the question, Spirit of God, what are you leading me to do? Distinction, absolutely, but distinction that identifies us with Christ. And we can already start to feel like, okay, yeah, I get where you're going with that. Like, I think if there was a little bit more of a contrast between my life and the life of the world, I probably would experience a little more pushback than I do, right? I think we can already start to see how that happens. If we can't quite get there, Jesus is going to go on and be like, okay, well, if you're thinking about noticeable distinction and identification, why don't you make this second commitment, which in a sense would anchor the first commitment into specific reality? Commitment number 2, embodying both the words and the works of Jesus. Right? I want to read you 22 through 24 again, but this time I want you to notice that Jesus highlights both his words and his works. And then we'll talk about the significance of that. Right? If I had not come and spoken to them, they would not be guilty of sin. Just quick theological aside, that doesn't mean that, oh, look, had Jesus never come to earth, then there would be no such thing as sin. And like, man, you really ruined everything by coming to earth. I know you came to save everybody, but you kind of also damned everybody in the same moment. And like, maybe it would have been better if you stayed in heaven. That's not what he means. What he means is because he came on earth, humanity was now capable of committing the ultimate sin, which would have been rejecting God to his face. That he was able to come and say, no, I have embodied God. God has come to dwell among us. I've told you straight up what the Father in heaven is like. I've told you what the kingdom of heaven looks like. I've just made it crystal clear. And if you're walking away from me, that's different than walking away from Isaiah. That's different than walking away from Jeremiah. That's different from walking away from Ezekiel. That's what he means, right? He's like, I came as God in human flesh, and I spoke the words of God to them, right? So now they have no excuse for their sin. The one who hates me also hates my Father, because everything Jesus says he got from his Father in heaven. If I had not done the works, notice he shifted, words, now no works, among them that no one else has done, they would not be guilty of sin. Now they have seen and hated both me and my Father. And that's where we get some really specific handles, right? Because in Acts chapter 20, he does it 2 different times, Paul says that he did not shrink back from declaring the full counsel of God. And I think that's what God is calling us to in terms of our speech. That as the people of God in this world, there should be times where we are willing to call that which is evil, evil. Where we are willing to be the people who trade vague generalities and leave behind, read between the lines, and don't just settle in, oh, I know that she knows what I think about that. And we have the courage to stand up and say what God would say in that moment. Not to hint, not to shrink back, but to actually call that which is evil, evil. Right? And if you're willing to go there, it's just a tremendous festival at times of persecution and hatred. Right? I feel like in some ways we've all experienced like bits and pieces of that over 2020. You say that any form of racism is contrary to the heart of God. Say that the Bible always teaches, not just about racism, but in all sin is both individual and systemic. That's Jesus' understanding of sin. You say things like that, and man, people tense up. All right, you say that life begins at conception. And you say that abortion is the taking of an innocent life. And you're going to get some blowback. You are. Wherever you land, right? It's not a question of whether you're on the political right or the political left. It's a question of whether you're going to fully express the teaching of Jesus in this book. Right? But what we do is we shrink back. We get really good at gauging just how far I can go. We get really good at kind of taking the temperature of the room and being like, all right, is this the kind of room where I should talk about marriage? Or is this the kind of room where I should talk about the fact that God was the original environmentalist and the creation mandate is to take care of the earth? Right? We do that game almost instinctively in DC where we're like, all right, what kind of room am I in? Let me read it. Let me figure out which kind of Jesus I want to be. Which kind of Christian do I want to be? And he's like, no, why don't you just be both? Why don't you have the courage to speak for a culture of life that is big enough to include taking care of the planet? I mean, we'll be both of those. Right? Again, that's where we're like, no, I don't know about that. And in some ways, he's like, well, just keep going, because the words of Jesus are not just about being the person that's like, that's wrong, and that's wrong, and that's wrong, and that's wrong. We got plenty of that on Twitter. It's also about being the people that are willing to speak the hope of the gospel. Which we're like, oh, okay, back on safe territory. Well, don't forget the hope of the gospel is that apart from Christ, every man, woman, and child on planet Earth is headed to eternity separated from God in a place called hell. That does not exactly go down easy in a pluralistic culture. Jesus did say, I am the way, the truth, and the life. The only way to the Father is through me. He really did. The apostles said, that Jesus is the only name under heaven by which a man can be saved, Acts 4:12. He's like, no, you need to be willing to go there too. Not just that Jesus is the one that changed your life, but that Jesus is the one who will save your soul. Right? We need to be willing to go there. right? We need to be willing to hold that out, right? We need to be willing to do the works of Christ, right? And again, we tend to reduce that to like just be a good person. In fact, if anything, I feel like, at least my own experiences, I feel like the works of Christ are almost where I gain credibility to share the words of Christ. Have you ever felt that way? I mean, I think there's actually something quasi-valid to that, where it's like, okay, I know there's some things in the theology of this church that are going to make some of you uncomfortable, but look at the way that we serve, and look at the radios that we've bought for kids in Ethiopia, and look at what we're doing for our neighbors in Chiralago, and look at the generosity. Okay, man, okay, good. We all feel good about that. And there's actually a little something to that dynamic. That's not like crazy at all. But some of you, the story of your life is actually the most intense persecution I experienced was when I actually started to live out some of the works of Jesus. Things were going great for you and God and your family, and then you mentioned to mom and dad that you wanted to get baptized as a follower of Christ, and boom, did it all blow up at that point. Or you mentioned that you weren't going to baptize your infant, and pooh, all of a sudden you're taking this Jesus stuff way too seriously. All of a sudden, you're using vacation time to go on mission trips, and people are like, man, I don't know about that. All of a sudden, you're orienting your dating life around who's the person that's going to lead me closest to God, not who's the person who denies the reality of Jesus, but, is awfully cute and nice to mom. Right? It's like, man, I'm actually starting to do what God calls me to do, and that's sometimes where we get ourselves in the most trouble. Now, here's my point with all of this. The reason I'm spending so much time in both camps is churches and people tend to take on personalities. There tend to be word kind of churches, all about preach the gospel. Man, let's be clear, right? Let's just be there, and if 3 people walk out of the sermon, that was a good day for me as a preacher. And then there tend to be works churches that are like, yeah, it's all social justice, and it's all great, and it doesn't matter how you're living your life, you're just awesome. Let's just all go to a food pantry together. Let's all go to a soup kitchen together. Right? We tend to be that way as people. Some of us are words people. Some of us are works people. Jesus is saying, no, if you want to fully embody me, you're going to be words and works. Right? It's not kind of like choose your own adventure here. It's like, no, fully follow Jesus in word and work. And you don't have to do that for very long before you're like, oh yeah, that got me into a little bit of trouble. But the last thing that we want to talk about today is making sure that we get in trouble for the right reasons. Right? It was John Perkins that talked about good trouble. Right? Commitment number 3, striving for holy innocence. Right? Notice what Jesus says in verse 25. But this happened so that the statement written in their law might be fulfilled. They hated me for no reason. He's deliberately quoting from Psalm 69. Psalm 69 was written by David, but everybody understood it was one of those psalms where David was talking about himself, but he's also talking about somebody else. He's also writing about some Messiah who's going to come. But Psalm 69 is all about the fact that David felt like he was being required to pay the price for crimes he hadn't committed. Psalm 69, verse 4, those who hate me without cause are more numerous than the hairs of my head. My deceitful enemies who would destroy me are powerful. Though I did not steal, I must repay. And he goes on to expand on that theme. I mean, by the way, is there a better depiction of Jesus than somebody who came to pay the price for a crime he didn't commit? I mean, that's the Son of God on the cross. You can see why people are like, he's talking a little bit about himself, and he's talking a lot of bit about Jesus, who comes to die for our crimes, who comes to die for our sin, even though he's innocent and blameless and beyond reproach. But the real subtext of what David is saying here is there's all of this opposition to me. And at the end of the day, the only thing I did wrong was just try to follow you, God. At the end of the day, the only thing I really did wrong was just trying to leverage my life for your glory. Right? In other words, he went out of his way not to give people a reason to persecute him. Right, we don't have time, for the sake of time, we don't need to look at the verses specifically, but 1 Peter talks a lot about this, where Peter will reflect, and he's like, okay, well, if you act poorly and you suffer for it, you don't get any points for that in heaven, right? It's when you act nobly and people persecute you and you endure that for the sake of God. That's what impresses the world, right? So what we need to be careful, again, we're not going out here like sign me up for persecution, but we want to live our lives in such a way that if it comes, we're 100% convinced it's because of our faith in Jesus, not because of our tendency to send really nasty emails, right? We don't want to be like, well, I think it's like 80% Jesus and 20% like snarky midnight emails. Like, I don't know, probably shouldn't send those, but he's like, no, make it your ambition to just live with holy innocence. Make it your ambition to live above reproach. And as you do, we'll trust God to lead us through that, right? It's one of those days where I feel like here's my hope. It's weird because I feel like I'm sort of like living out the sermon. My guess is I've said some things today that have bothered some of you. And even if it was a quick aside or a quick thing that I mentioned, you're like, oh man, I don't know about that. I don't like that you said that, right? And there's a part of me that wants to try to figure out how to wrap it up with a perfect bow where I'm like, oh, okay, it's okay. We're all back together. We all 100% on everything. But I think part of what Jesus is calling us to, and part of what it would be so beautiful if we could embody as a church is like, I don't fully agree with everything you said. Man, there are some things that we need to talk about. There's some emails we need to exchange. There's some coffees we need to have. But overall, I get the direction that you're going in. I get the long arc of the gospel, and I'm really intrigued by the story of a God who comes to pay the price for a crime he didn't commit. We tend to think about God just sitting up on the judgment seat of heaven and being like, oh no, I'm the one who imposes the penalty. There's a sense where that's true, but God's not just sitting there waiting to pass judgment on your life. He's already sent his baby boy to rescue and to redeem and to deliver. And the hope of the church is that we can come together in that gospel and then work out all of the other implications of how we treat each other and work on a common understanding of morality and ethics and the life that God has called us to live. Right? So I would say maybe if today was one of those days that was harder for you, I would just encourage you to keep leaning in. Keep seeing the full counsel of God. And realize that what Jesus is calling us to is not maybe as shocking as it sounds, right? This whole following God thing should matter. Like, it should make a difference. If it doesn't, if we just go with the crowd except on Sunday morning, then what's the point of the whole thing? I think one of the other things that's been on my mind all week is that we have a tendency to either over-apply or under-apply this message. Like, I will talk to Christians, and I don't think we have a ton in our church, but every once in a while, who feel like their entire life is nothing but an unending stream of persecution. They're like, I've been persecuted by every boss I've ever had at every job since I was 14, and it's always, take up my cross, and they're always out to get me because I'm a Christian. And usually my response to that is like, well, maybe you're also just a bad employee. Like, maybe it's not persecution. Maybe you're lazy. Like, we should talk about that. Like, it's not the name of Jesus. It's the fact that you can't get there on time. Like, stop calling everything persecution, right? It's not all Satan coming after you. Sometimes it's just like set a second alarm clock. Okay, we got a little bit of that. But there's also kind of probably the majority of us that are like, man, this is so good. And I have that one missionary friend, at least I knew him in college. I think he's still in China. I'll try to send him the link to this because he's in China. Obviously, you need this if you're in China, but I don't even know if I send him the link, will he get the link and will he get arrested and get persecuted and get beaten because I sent him the link to an American sermon? I don't know. I'll wrestle through that one and send him a cryptic email later today of whether he wants the link to the sermon, but that's how you apply this one. I just, I work as an accountant in D.C. Like, this doesn't really apply to me. For the last 10 days, as I've been getting ready for this talk, I've been thinking about a couple in our church that has actually experienced this kind of firsthand over the last 10 days. And it's somebody you know well. John Michael's going to come up and just share a little bit about what he and Catherine have been walking through. Felt like the easiest way to do that was for me to just tell a tiny bit of their story. Not like it's my story to tell, but just not ask John Michael to have to go through that experience. And he's just going to talk a little bit about how God has been meeting him in this season. And he's going to take a minute and pray for us, and then we're going to close in one last song. But John Michael and his wife, Catherine, have been on this journey of embryo adoption for a couple of months, decent chunk of time. Right now, something that they love to talk to people about. So if some of you want to get more information about, they'd love to talk to you. But they've been going through this process, and honestly, man, it's just gone great for them. I mean, just everything health-wise for them has been great. I was just, kind of cruising through this process. They had actually selected a couple. They're like, man, we would love to talk to you about adopting your embryo, and, feel really great about that. And then about 10 days ago, they got the email from the couple, despite the fact that the couple registered with a Christian adoption agency, got an email saying, no, thanks for picking us. We're not picking you. And it's because you're Christians. It's because of your faith. We do not want you to raise our kid. And I'm sharing that to be like, man, see, I think we live in this world where we don't think that emails like that get sent. But they do, including to one of the men who's a pastor at our church. And, my heart in asking John Michael to come and his heart in wanting to come is not to be like, all right, let's end with the tearjerker story. But I can't really tell you from firsthand experience how God meets us in moments like that. But John Michael can, right? And he can spend a few minutes to tell you how he's experienced God over these last 10 days, how he and Catherine have processed this together as a couple. So he's going to come, he's going to share, then I've asked him to pray, and we'll close out in one last song. But why don't you come on up and share with us however you feel that, okay?
Thanks, John. I'm going to be honest with everybody that it feels really weird to be up here talking about this. Not because, like John said, we don't want to talk about our journey with embryo adoption. It's actually something that Catherine and I are really passionate about. It's something that was brand new to us when we found out about it, and we both just kind of feel like we have a new mission of we just want to tell everybody we can about this incredible opportunity to not only preserve life, to value life, but to give existing lives an opportunity to be lived out. But it feels weird because it's not about us. The adoption itself is not about us. We've been on our own journey of infertility for going on, I lose count, I think 3.5 years or something like that. And I'm also incredibly aware of the reality that there are families in RCC that have journeyed and struggled with a similar road for far longer and far more painful. But the reality is, for all of us, it's not about us. It's about Jesus Christ. And whether or not our lives actually point to him, and a good portion of my life didn't point to Jesus, and I'm so grateful that it is beginning to align more and more with him now. But when John asked us to consider sharing a little bit about how we have seen God show up in this experience of our lives, how we've seen him present himself, it took a lot of prayer. It took a lot of being still and listening. And we're still on that journey. In some ways, we still don't fully see what he's up to. But the one thing that has really stood out to me personally, and it's different for me than it is for Catherine, just like it is our journey compared to some of your journeys. But one thing that has really stood out to me, on top of the reality that he is just such a merciful God, is his desire for every human being on this planet, not just for those of us who already call ourselves Christians, but for that couple that said thanks, but no thanks. Part of our journey in choosing a family was to pray for them, to pray for the children that they already have, for their relationship to exist with God. But when we got that no, the reality hit that not only did these two parents not know Jesus, but their 3 beautiful daughters, 3 triplets that are about 3 years old, are going to grow up in a household that hates Jesus. And it just hit me. I don't know what will come of this journey in the future. I don't know what else God wants to do with it. But in that moment, he transformed my understanding of the call to love our enemies and pray for those who persecute us. In the past, it felt kind of like this I really dislike this person, and I can't believe they cut me off in traffic, so I'm going to pray for them. And that's going to be my good Christian duty. But it's got to be rooted in love. And I genuinely desire for this family to come to know Jesus. So I've been begging him to use our story, to use the letter that we wrote to them, describing our life to them, that he would gnaw at their hearts and tug on the strings of their emotions until they can't deny him any longer. And every single one of us has a different journey with Christ, a different background and different purposes that he wants to use our journeys for. So the different forms of hatred or persecution that we will experience will look differently. But at the end of the day, they all go to the one common goal of making the name of Jesus known. Sometimes it's a joyful, happy moment, and sometimes it's riddled with an entire day of really ugly crying. But that's my prayer for our church, that we would be willing to have those experiences happen, both the joyful, happy ones and the painful ones, because our God is a God who can handle it all. So I'm going to pray for our church. I'm also going to pray for those amidst us who are on a similar journey of infertility. We have seen some pretty painful things come out of this pandemic related to marriages in general. But we also know that there are so many people who desperately desire to grow their family for Jesus, and it just hasn't gone the way they've expected. So join me as I pray for our church, for those struggling with infertility, and just for all of us to live out this commitment of a life that points to Jesus. Gracious Father, we come to you today knowing that we don't have it in us to live out the life you've invited us to on our own. Whether our struggles are infertility or financial issues or hatred towards us because of the color of our skin or health or any myriad of things that legitimately make a life lived for you difficult. But God, I'm also aware of the reality that more often than not, it's my own pride and ego that get in the way. So I just ask that you would help RCC understand the gift that you have given us a little bit better today. That you would give us just a little bit stronger of a nudge to speak when an opportunity presents itself, to speak of your name, and to act when the situation calls for action. But that our number one motivation would be worship to you through the life that we live. And I pray for those families within our church, those visiting, those watching online, that are on a journey of infertility. And I just ask that you would make your presence tangibly known to them, that they would feel you next to them, and in front of them and behind them and all around them as they take one step at a time on this journey, learning to submit their desires to you more and more each day, but also understanding the power and the might of the God that they serve who can do all things. We do ask that you would fill the walls of our church up with little ones running around and making messes and making noise, and that would all be worship to you, Jesus. Be the God of encouragement that you promised to be in our lives. Be the God of hope and the God that saves, as we know in our heads so much that you are, but sometimes our hearts struggle to believe. And let us leave today excited, no matter what life looks like right now, because our hope is always in you. We love you, Jesus, and we need you desperately. Be with us as we go today.